Hello, I am Nalani Brown, the philanthropy coordinator at Frank Toby Jones, finishing up the book Mozart Starling by Leanda Lynn Hopp. We are on chapter 9. It's called Mozart's Ear and the Music of the Spheres. In a dusty corner of Mozart's Birthhouse Museum in Salzburg, there's a small room with lesser ephemeris tucked into glass cases and tacked onto walls. Cards and concert notes and silhouette portraits of distant relatives. I was there on a sunny day, and the rooms were dark. I'd been at the museum for hours, seen all I thought I wanted to see, and was feeling tempted to rush on outside into the light and visit a pruned chestnut vendor I'd passed by the front step on my way in. But I reminded myself that I'd come all this way to contemplate such bits and bobs, so I sighed and stepped through the door frame. Nothing much caught my eye until I spotted a little lithograph, not much bigger than a postcard, at chest height near the door leading out of the room. On it, there were 2 penciled ears. The one on the right was called Normal Ear, and it's in German. Gewünschtes Ohr. And the left was called Mozart's Ohr. This sketch had been printed in the biography of Mozart by Greg Nikolaus von Niesen, Constance's second husband, with the comment, "The construction of Mozart's ears was completely different from the norm," and the claim that Wolfgang and Constance's son Franz had inherited this rare ear shape. At first, both ears pictured looked normal to me, so I began to surreptitiously inspect the ears of the other Mozart pilgrims in the room to get a better sense of what most ears really look like. Sure enough, the Mozart ear had at least 2 distinctions. The large, curved upper part of the ear, called the antihelix, as I learned in my later research for outer ear anatomy, is broad, flat, and rather squared. And the small flap in front of the ear canal, called the tragus, is greatly reduced. It is difficult to find portraits of Mozart to corroborate Nissen's claim. In most paintings, his hair is covering his ears. But a portrait of Franz and brother Karl as young boys, the only 2 Mozart children to survive beyond infancy, does seem to show a reduced tragus on Franz. His upper ear is not visible. And the book by Nissen was overseen by Constance, who would have known more than anyone living about Mozart's ears. She insisted that certain things be whitewashed in the biography, but there would have been no reason to misinform readers about an ear. The sketch is likely credible. It is probable and that the strangeness of Mozart's ears caused him some embarrassment. Maybe they are always covered in portraits because he wanted to hide them. This is auricular nonconformity remains rare today, but it is not unheard of and is colloquially called Mozart's ear by specialists. What might it mean for a composer, of all people, to have an oddly shaped ear? A person like Mozart, whose life was dedicated to creation via sound. When I got home from Austria, I talked with ear doctors and audiologists, and though everyone I spoke to emphasized that they were speculating, there was a general consensus. A filiform tragus helps distinguish sounds that come from both the front and the rear. Sounds that originate in front of a person can sometimes be overwhelming to the inner ear, and it is believed that the tragus provides a small barrier that subtly filters such sounds. Sounds that come from behind, by contrast, are already dampened by the ear pinna, so the tragus has an opposite function. It serves as a funnel that collects sound and bounces it into the inner ear. For someone with a small or non-existent tragus, sounds coming from the front might be louder, fuller, more nuanced, or more distinct. Sounds from behind, however, might be dissipated or diminished, making it difficult for the listener to tell where they came from. The fact of all this on Mozart as a composer is a matter of conjecture, but it does seem likely, at the very least, that Mozart experienced sound somewhat differently than most of us. It is impossible to say whether such an altered listening influenced his compositions, but it would certainly have led to an uncommon immersion in the oral dimension of life. I wonder how Mozart tilted his head to calm the sound before him, discern the sound from behind, or balance his heightened sense of the difference between the two. I think of Carmen's sweet turn of head, the way she lifts her strange bird ear when I call her name or when she's listening attentively to music, or really to anything. Star did this too, as starlings do. One morning early this spring, I was walking in the wooded park near my home. The migratory flycatchers, tangers, thrushes, and warblers were just beginning to arrive from their long flights, all the way from Mexico, Central America, South America. I'd left my binoculars at home that day, intent on walking unencumbered and letting my other, non-visual senses get in shape for the onslaught of growth and movement and birdsong that the season would bring. I heard a little chirp in an aspen and stopped to listen. There, I was startled by a young man who paused and looked back at me. "I like the way you tilt your head," he told me, and walked on. The oddest compliment I'd ever received, but I liked it. Yes, I thought, this is just the attitude I want to cultivate. The tilt of the head, the listening for something just beyond the normal hearing. Birdsong is the perfect invitation to such listening. Eleanor Ratcliffe at the University of Surrey engaged in a years-long study to determine the effects of birdsong on listeners. She's learning that human reactions to birdsongs are as varied as the songs themselves. Most of us are unsettled by raucous vocalizations, like those of a crow chasing a predator from its nest. But when we hear the cooing of pigeons, or the spring song of robins, or even just the background chatter of yardbirds, Ratcliffe's study and those of others show that most people respond with decreased stress, increased calm, better concentration, brightened mood, and heightened creativity. Some find it easier to access meditative states while listening to birdsong. All these responses are analogous. All these responses are analogous to the way a certain musical composition lifts and changes our mood and increases our receptivity to the world around us. Both music and birdsong flit past our tympanic membranes, connect with our brains, brighten our minds, and transport our spirits. More than other ambient environmental sound, birdsong speaks in the musical language of pitch, rhythm, lilt, and repetition. But is it right to call birdsong music? By way of metaphor, there can be no argument. It is humans who choose the word song for the seasonal vocalizations of passerine birds, a word that is used even the most academic of ornithological text. But if we want to transcend metaphor and suggest that birdsong is music in the same way that human composition is music, then we are wandering into a scholarly fray that most of us did not know existed. Birdsong carried through nearly every habitat on Earth for millions of years before primates appeared. And so, human evolution occurred against a backdrop of avian music. Cultures across all continents and times long before and after Mozart developed music that was inspired by and based on the sounds made by local birds. Over the decades, naturalists, ornithologists, musicologists, philosophers, and poets have found parallels and counterparts between the two. Scales, ornaments, trills, inversions, themes, variations. Not every passerine bird that sings uses all the attributes of human music, but all of them can be found in the combined repertoire of the world's songbirds. Darwin noted the resemblance of birdsong to musical composition and believed that birds possess an aesthetic sense. The well-known ornithologist Luis Baptista, in his paper, Why Birdsong is Sometimes Like Music, writes, "Some birdsong is pitched to the same scale as Western music, which is one possible reason for human attraction to these sounds." Other prominent ornithologists wrote that white-crowned sparrows sing a perfect fourth interval between their first and second notes. That the canyon wren, with its gorgeous cascading series of notes that bounce against the desert stone walls, sings in the chromatic scale of 12 pitches per octave. That the wood thrush's layered song is pitched on the western scale. The list could go on for pages. One of the most intriguing comparisons of human music and birdsong was penned by the philosopher Charles Hartshorne, Student of process theologian Alfred North Whitehead. Like Whitehead, Hartshorne saw the divine in the unfolding of earthly creation, in which humans participate. He was a gifted and committed amateur ornithologist, and he spent nearly an entire century, almost the whole of his 103-year life, immersed in the study of birdsong, research that culminated in the 1973 opus Born to Sing, an interpretation and world survey of birdsong. It's an unusual book that combines scientific observation and quantification with the language of poetry, philosophy, and possibility. In his life of listening, Hartshorne located nearly every element of human musical composition in the songs of birds. Structure, rhythmic variation, melody, verse. Accelerando, retardando, crescendo, diminuendo. The essential difference between avian and human music, suggested Hartshorne, is temporality, with the repeatable patterns in birdsong having an upper limit about 15 seconds. He evidently did not record starlings. In spite of his well-documented examples and a book that is a wonder to read, Hartshorne had been criticized for being too expansive and speculative, too philosophical for the topic to hand, which some felt ought to remain securely in the scientific citadel. A recent paper published in Animal Behavior seeks to set that record straight. For his paper, Is Birdsong Music?, evaluating harmonic intervals in songs of a neotropical songbird, Marcelo Arias-Salas, a PhD candidate in the Animal Behavior Lab at New Mexico State University, studied the voice of the tiny nightingale wren, Microcirculus philomela, chosen for its complex musical bird song. The bird is just a little bit bigger than a mouse, brown all over, with delicate curved black and cream speckling on its breast. Its eyes huge and black. When it throws its head back to sing, it almost seems to shapeshift. The song is so startling, loud and beautiful, that the bird appears to become twice as large as it really is. When the song is finished, there again is just the avian mouse in place of the giant singing wren. Arias-Salas gathered recordings of the nightingale wren from its entire range across Central and South America and analyzed songs from 81 individual birds alongside the well-known chromatic, major diatonic, and major pentatonic scales. These scales, he argues, are the ones that represent the most intuitive pattern in which birds might base their songs. As a starting point for evaluation, he held up the harmonic birdsong hypothesis, the notion that if birdsong was music, then consecutive notes in a bird's song would be closer to harmonic intervals in these common scales than we would expect from chance. He evaluated 243 of his recordings alongside the musical scales to determine whether the wren songs conformed to harmonic intervals, and determined that, in all of these compositions, there were only 6 instances of wrens singing harmonic intervals, only about 2%. Just what we would expect from chance, certainly not more. Arias-Salas argues, if the frequencies are not determined by harmonic intervals in this species, it seems likely that it happens in other birds with more complex song elements. He concludes that those who suggest a closer parallel between music and birdsong are simply misguided. Documented musical properties in birds might be caused by cultural biases of the listener or misunderstanding of the physics of musical compositions. Arias-Salas's conclusion gave me pause. Documented musical properties in birds might be caused by cultural biases of the listener or misunderstanding of the physics of musical compositions. In other words, if you think birdsong is music, it is your own little sad misunderstanding. The study is an interesting one with much food for thought, but the conclusions drastically overreach. The paper tells us the song of one passerine species does not display harmonicity. That's one bird of about 4,000 species, each with a unique song, and the measures was just a tiny sample of Western musical scale. There are many other scales and harmonic forms people consider music, both in West and across the globe. And the conclusion that this particular bird song is not strictly anal analogous to a few particular Western musical scales? Well, we already know that. But does that mean it's not music in some form, or that it's not musical? David Rothenberg is an academic philosopher, a musician, and a studied amateur ornithologist. In his wonderful book, Why Birds Sing, he cautions us against failing to distinguish between what birdsong is for and what birdsong is. We know the ornithological explanations for the function of birdsong: the creation and defense of a territory, the declaration of sexual maturity, the attracting and securing of a mate. This is what birdsong is for. But as for what birdsong is, music, Rothenberg declares. In my college-level ornithology text, authors Joel Welty and Luis Baptista listed the usual reproductive, social, and individual functions of birdsong, but added that they could not rule out the possibility that birds sing from a sense of well-being or simply for the joy of it. And it was the philosopher Charles Hartshorne who added to the list of ornithological functions of birdsong bliss. The longer I ponder, the more I come to realize that the question of whether birdsong is strictly music, while a good question, is not my question. Determining a clear statement of the proper relationship between birdsong and music might have value for scientists and musicologists, in a strict academic setting bound by lexiconic definitions of words like music and harmony. The discussion gains a kind of interest and worth. This way of knowing was inherent beauty, and I do not mean to disparage it, but in this moment, with a Mozart quartet playing softly on the stereo as I write, and a tiny round orange-crowned warbler in a tree outside my study window, lending his trill to top the allegro movement, I close my eyes and hear them both entering my ears, and I cannot tease them completely apart. It would feel frugal and tight-fisted to suggest that one is music and the other is not. And in such matters, I do not want to feel tight-fisted. I want to feel profligate. It is another day at the forested park near my home, and well into summer. I'm sitting in the grass, leaning against the thick trunk of a Douglas fir, and staring up to the branches of a thick and knotted big leaf maple. My mossy seat is not a well-kept or frequently trotted area of the park. I was drawn by the raucous cawing of two juvenile ravens, and I wandered over for a look. Ravens are not common here, and this is the first time in some years that they have successfully nested in the park. 3 young hatched, but one of these was killed while it was still floppy and small, most likely by an off-leash dog. I am being eaten alive by biting flies. But I stay where I am because one of the young birds has flown from the tangled woods and into the tree right next to me, from where she calls to her sibling, "Caw! Caw!" So loud. This young bird is perfecting the scream with an underlying low croak that characterizes the vocalizations of her species, already distinguishable from any other bird. But in spite of the ruckus she's making, the little raven appears calm, quiet in spirit, loud in voice. She looks down at me, unfazed, as naive young birds are. She fluffs her wings, calls again. It is good to be in her company. In my notebook, I sketch the tree, sketch the bird. I squint at my drawing, and even then it is not good. I close my eyes and I listen. Crow, red-breasted nut thatch, the cheering of starlings in a nearby nest, the tapping of a downy woodpecker, robins, the spiral song of the Swanson's thrush, human children, traffic, a motorcycle, the low of a ferry coming into dock, bush tits, chickadees, olive-sided flycatcher, a bird whose voice I do not know, which makes me vaguely uncomfortable, a rustle on the ground in the tangle of ferns and huckleberry and nucta rose, a mouse, a Pacific wren. At this urban woodland park, it is just as likely to be a rat. A woman calls to her child, "Gabby!" The only sound louder than the ravens. Spotted townie. More crows, mad ones. They don't like the ravens, but there may also be a sharp, shiny hawk nearby. A sharp-shinned hawk nearby. I keep my eyes closed as all the sounds soften, yet heighten and blend. I visualize them surrounding me. a map blanket of resonance all around me. But now there's a strict right next to my ear. So startling that I cheat and peek. A brown creeper hanging on the tree bark. I can barely keep calm. The creeper pays me no mind. Excuse me. In my stillness, and the tiny scrape of creeper toenail in my ears is as loud as a truck. I want to squeal, but I close my eyes back down, farther down. I calm my excited creeper nerves. There is my breathing, and can I hear it? Yes, there's my heartbeat. When I finally open my eyes, I am Rip Van Winkle, unsure of how much time has passed. All the sound is still here, still everywhere, and the raven is still above me. Hi, I whisper, but her eyes now are lightly closed. Perhaps she too hears her own heartbeat, faster than mine. Surely she does. But here's her sibling raven flapping in the branches. Clumsy and new, he flies to another tree, perhaps 100 yards away. And the craws come loudly. This is too far. The siblings want to be close. My raven looks up, shakes off her own young silence, screams, and flies in the direction of her brother. There is a movement of grass, of bodies. The sounds continue. All of them are more. They rise, fall, become almost silent, rise again. Is this it? I wonder out loud. Why not? The rest of the earth seems to be wondering aloud. Am I wrong to think that this is the music of the spheres? When we use this phrase colloquially, we refer to a poetic sensibility or a philosophic notion. To hear the music of the spheres is to feel in harmony with life, with self. We have seen something of incomparable beauty or achieved a state of bliss through meditation or yoga or mountain climbing. We find ourselves ridiculously alive after a horrific accident, or we've fallen suddenly in love. Somehow the world itself is singing to us, and we are listening in a rarefied way. Our ancestors were more attuned to the movements of the heavens than most of us are today. This was partly because the night skies were more visible due to the absence of bright lights, but people who depended on gathering, hunting, and small-scale farming for survival also relied on the movements of the stars to locate themselves in time, in seasons, in the cycles of planting and harvesting. In Egypt, the appearance of shining Sirius presaged the annual flooding of the Nile. The regular movements of the stars above were reassuring and gave some sense of rhythm and predictability in a time that was plagued by harsh awareness of the ephemerality of life. Against the predictability of the stars, though, lie the discomforting wandering of the planets, the world itself, from the Greek planetes, wanderers. If the stars had meaning in relation to earthly cycles and events, as they clearly did, then the planets must have messages as well. But these messages were incomprehensible, impossible to read. When an elite priesthood claimed that they couldn't decipher the messages of the planets, they became the first astrologers. Humans' pursuit of meaning in the planets likely began 200,000 years ago or more. We can only wonder over speculations of the early sky watchers. But by the time Pythagoras was born in 570 BC on the Greek island of Samos, there was in place a strong human desire to find a fundamental regularity of baffling complex planetary movements. Pythagoras himself is a shadowy figure, a kind of cipher about whom little is known, and yet somehow the history of geometry has come to be written within his thin biography. It is possible that even eponymous theorem might have been outlined centuries earlier by mathematicians in Egypt, India, or Babylonia. But we do know with certainty that Pythagoras and his followers sought links between numbers, geometry, and the structure of the natural world, believing that all of these were interconnected and that the connections themselves had not just mathematical, but also ethical and spiritual significance. In their search for mathematical and earthly harmony, the Pythagoreans explored music and musical instruments. They recognized that when you pluck two strings, twice the length of the other, a perfect octave is produced. Exploring further, they found that strings with a length ratio of 2 to 3 produced an interval called a fifth, which is pleasing to the human ear. Western music was largely developed around such intervals. The violin has 4 strings, each a fifth apart. Though the Pythagoreans did not possess the mathematics or the astronomical knowledge to posit anything but the vaguest of theories, their melodic explorations led them to propose a music of the spheres, a harmonious relationship that linked the planets to one another in just the way strings arranged on a violin produce notes that vibrate in harmony. The idea of a universal harmony founded in sound is not unique to Western mathematics. In Hinduism, there is the notion of Shabad, which is sometimes interpreted as an audible life stream. Humans can enter this current through the chanting of the universal symbol Om, which activates the energy centers in the human body and promotes physical and spiritual resonance with the wider universe. And in the Gospel, according to John 1, it is written, "In the beginning was the Word," which has, many scholars claim, would be more accurately translated as, "In the beginning was the sound," not a primordial soup, but a primordial hum. 2,000 years after Pythagoras, the German mathematician Johannes Kepler, an advocate of Copernicus's new heliocentric theories, followed up on the notion. Kepler sought to understand the sacred architecture of the solar system and to find mathematical harmony in the way that planets are placed in space. After a series of misguided propositions, Kepler eventually became the first known mathematician to accurately describe planetary orbits. He formulated the principle now referred to as Kepler's first law of planetary motion, which states that orbits are not circular. It was initially presumed, but elliptical. And later his second law, which established that the spread of the ellipse increases the farther a planet is from the sun. With these laws, Kepler gave us a roundabout pathway back to Pythagoras and a planetary orchestra. Pythagoras based his inquiries into harmony on musical notes. But as any string player knows, no note that is actually performed is mathematically pure. Every note played on an instrument is influenced by other notes, the subtle vibrations of the other strings, and even nearby instruments. When my daughter plays a D on her cello, the D string on my violin a few feet away hums, even though no one's touching it. There are musical overtones, and they create complexity we look for in a good musical instrument. Geophysicist David Waltham elucidates his concept in the book Lucky Planet. The overtones, he stresses, are what makes instruments unique. If a pure sound were possible, then all instruments would sound very much alike, and the orchestra pit would be dull indeed. Instead, overtones follow the unique sounds of a violin versus a piano versus a French horn, creating a world of interaction between material substance, space, and sound. The simplification might torture a cosmologist, but there is an analogy in the movement of the planets. The orbit of each planet in our solar system has a characteristic wobbling, a tilt that it oscillates. As it oscillates, interacts with the oscillations of other planets tilted, slightly wobbly, ever so changing orbits. The resulting vibrations are the planetary overtones, and when they mingle, they create a complex hum, the background music of our universe, our planet, our lives. Simple, perfectly parallel spherical orbits would not allow the friction that could create such a sound. So Kepler really was on the path that led to our modern understanding of music, of the music of the spheres. This planetary hum is 50 octaves below the hearing range of humans, but scientists have modeled the orbital oscillations and raised the frequency to human range that they can play back for us. The sound is a kind of chaotic scream that, as it goes on, lowers in pitch and increases in volume, as would be expected of expanding elliptical orbits. Waltham again suggests musical instruments by way of analogy. A cello is lower and louder than a violin of the same shape. The sound, writes Waltham, must be more like the familiar chaos of an orchestra tuning up. Not wholly unpleasant, but still discordant and unpredictable. then of the orchestra coming together to perform a concerto. More like a gull, he says, than a nightingale. Or perhaps I cannot help thinking, like the whistle of a starling. And overlaid upon this music of the spheres, this present but unhearable starling-esque hum, there is the music that we hear and make daily. There is the music of Bach, of Messiaen, of Mozart, of the woodland wren, the woodpecker's drum, the laughter of an infant, the drag of an old woman's crane against the sidewalk. David Rothenberg wrote, "Species are supposed to sing only for their own kind, but the more I listen, the less I'm sure. Yesterday I heard all the thrushes singing together in the laurel woods, veeries, hermits, and wood thrushes. They all seem to be getting at a total song. I recognize this as the song from my woodland meditation. Human and natural music both make mischief with our ingrained patterns of separatedness." Years ago, I heard the late Zen Buddhist teacher Robert Aitken give a reading at Elliott Bay Company, Seattle's famed indie shop. After, those who had gathered for the talk walked out the doors into a warm late summer evening. Aitken Roshi had ended with a short meditation. Our minds were rushed and open. It seemed sudden when someone pointed and called out, "Look at the birds." There in the urban sky was a cloud of starlings, thousands of starlings, swirling in one of their great mesmerizing orbs. "It's a sign," someone whispered. And it was a sign. Autumn was coming. In the spring and summer, starlings divide into couples and then family groups in the business of mating and nesting. But in the late summer, this exclusivity breaks down, and starlings begin to gather into the groups that grow into their huge fall and winter flocks. Flocking has many benefits. Through force of numbers, birds find and share food, roosts, and warmth, and, in flight, they foil aerial predators. When a hawk sees a solitary bird, it can focus on that bird as prey with efficient single-mindedness. But a flock becomes an organism in itself, making it difficult for a predator to zero in on an individual bird. Starlings seem to take the evolutionary mechanism of flocking into the realm of high art when they gather in hundreds, thousands, sometimes even a million birds, and turn about the sky in mysterious, graceful, spellbinding dance clouds called mermations. These are evasive maneuvers, complicated enough to beguile even a peregrine falcon, the most formidable of aerial predators. But they bewitch the human mind as well. As we watch them converge into great spheres, then swirl into funnels and ellipses, startling murmurations lift us to an elated, almost hypnotic state. Some ornithologists claim that starling flocks were originally named murmurations because of the varied songs and sounds that the starlings create. But starlings do not call out much during their flock dances, and I am more inclined to agree with other avian etymologists who believe that the name comes from the whisper of wings. So many wings together in flight. Beneath a murmation, I feel that I am kneeling in an ancient cathedral, and ought to be silent, but instead whispers overhead with the gathered prayers of hundreds of years of the pilgrims. There is a much greater cathedral, the entire sky, and the prayers are light brushings of feathers. For centuries, humans have looked up at these murmuring flock prayers and asked, how? Why do they spin and change and rise and gather and spread? All of them at exactly the same time. With so many birds in the air, it is imperative that everyone keeps going the same direction. If even a single bird goes its own way, there will be aerial crashes and broken wings. Yet there has never been a satisfactory explanation for the phenomenon. Perhaps there was a lead bird that all the rest watched and followed, but sometimes the flock spread the length of several city blocks. There is no way that the bird at one end could see the bird at the other. Maybe the leader gave a social signal, unhearable to us on the ground. Maybe they were involved in Rupert Sheldrakean group mind. Maybe they were involved in a Rupert Sheldrakean group mind, a group of morphic resonance? Maybe so. The explanation for such preternatural coordination seems to transcend traditional biology. And now, the technology has caught up enough to give researchers the ability to look carefully at murmurations through high-powered video, high resolution, and slow motion, and computational modeling. This seems to be true. Starling flocks do fly beyond the parameters of biology and into the realm of cutting-edge physics. In 2010, University of Rome theatrical physicist Giorgio Parisi published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Parisi and his team found that starling murmurations function in the same way as various natural systems on the cusp of a shift, described by scientists as critical transitions. These are systems that are poised to tip into a sheer transformation. Like metals becoming magnetized, liquids turn into gas, or gathered snow in the moment of before an avalanche. In such traditional moments, the moment or velocity of one particle affects all the others, no matter how many others there are, in what is called a self-scale-free correlation. In terms of starling murmurations, the change in velocity or movement of one starling would affect all the rest, whether there were 50 others or 50,000. But if every bird is busy paying attention to all the others, how does one individual launch a change in the whole? How does that whole respond so quickly? The answers remain murky. But a couple of years after their initial paper, Parisi's team took their research further, paying attention to the correlation of each individual to the bird closest to it. It turns out the change in movement of birds will affect 7 birds closest to it. Those 7 birds will each affect 7 more birds, and their movement will ripple, scaling rapidly through the flock. How it happens so incredibly fast is still a mystery of the subject of ongoing research. But it is postulated that these movements of transition in starling moments may mirror universal principles at work in the proteins and neurons that underlie the makeup and movement of all creatures. Thus, starling murmurations might be the most visible and also the most winsome interaction of biophysical creativity, a mirror into deeper, unseen, all-embracing secrets of life that have yet to be understood. Watching them, I feel that mystery viscerally. I feel my head swirl and my body sway. I always thought this was because the movements of murmurations are so graceful, and surely that is a part of it. But it may also arise from the unconscious identification with the same movements at work within the neurons of my own brain and neural synapses. Deep calling unto deep, as the psalmist sang. One late Welsh poet, John O'Donoghue, spoke of the earthen wisdom possessed by our animal brothers and sisters. The animals are more ancient than us, he argues. They enjoy a seamless presence, a lyrical unity with the earth. Animals live outside in the wind, in the waters, in the mountains, and in the day. The knowing of each earth is in them. And by our attunement, by the tilt of our heads and our enlarged listening, we enter this knowing on a state of shared awareness and being that O'Donoghue refers to inner flow. It is from this beautiful feral place that we are able to respond to the breath of inspiration that summons us to the fullness of our creativity. Full because we are cognizant that we are not a lone pair of hands or eyes or a single voice, that we do not create in isolation but bring our gift, the art of our lives, to one another, to the earth. We each touch the 7 starlings closest to us in our own murmuration, and the ripple spreads faster than we would have imagined. We create from what Clarissa Pinkola Estes calls the Rio Abajo river, the river beneath the river. The song just beneath our typical hearing, the murmuration that calls the tiniest neutrons of our brains into flight. And what is wild summons? What art is asked for us? The gift offered is different from each, but all are equal in grandeur. To paint, to draw, dance, compose, to write songs, poems, letters, diaries, prayers, to set a violet on the sill, stitch a quilt, to bake bread, plant marigolds, beans, apple trees. To follow the track of the forest elk, the neighborhood coyote, the cupboard mouse. To open the windows, air the beds, sweep the corners. To hold the child's hand, listen to the vagrant story. Paint the elder friend's fingernails a delightful shade of pink while wrapped in a blanket she knit with the deft young fingers of the past. To wander paths, nibble, purslane, notice spiders. To be rained upon, to listen with changed ears, and sing back what we hear. Okay, that is the end of chapter 9. We're gonna stop here today and pick up on the finale, 3 Funerals and a Flight of Fancy. This is coming out of Mozart's Starling by Leonda Lynn Haupt. My name is Nalani Brown. I'm the philanthropy coordinator at Frank Toby Jones, reading for you here today at the Point Defiance Reston Senior Center. Thank you for listening, and we'll pick up next time with the finale.